This is Colonel Denny Gillem. It's 20 minutes after the hour, and you're in formation and listening to the Frontlines of Freedom all across America. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, MD, is a U.S. Navy veteran, a medical doctor, a Muslim, and a gung-ho American patriot who formed the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He's gung-ho about democracy. He's also written what I consider to be a must-read book for everybody who cares about America. It's called A Battle for the Soul of Islam. Welcome to Frontlines of Freedom, Dr. Jasser.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Danny. Thanks for having me.
Folks, forgive me for getting a little pushy here, but I became a Mideast war planner in the late 1970s, and I've maintained my interest there ever since. I've read the Quran. I thought I understood a lot about the Muslim culture, but I knew there were some things I just didn't get. Dr. Jasser's book opened those doors for me. If you're in military, law enforcement, politics, government, or religion, you need to read this book. You'll find out why as we talk. Okay, now I'll slow down a little bit. Zuhdi, let's start with your background. You were born in America to Muslim parents who immigrated from Syria. Tell us a little bit about growing up in America as a Muslim.
Well, I'll tell you first, and I think it's really important that people understand where we came from and that my family had escaped Syria, unable to practice really not only their political ideas, but their religious philosophy the way they felt. Because of the environment there, and now we see what's happening in Syria. It's the same government, just the sun, and they kill people in the streets for having any ideas. And my family escaped in the mid-'60s, coming to the U.S. and ultimately settling in Wisconsin, where I grew up. And we built our first a mosque up there with just 3 or 4 families. And I learned an Islam that was free from any intervention from government, from imams being present in controlling interests in society, etc. It was just a very personal learning of the faith with my parents and other families there. And it was a very American narrative that so many other faiths have seen in this country, whether it's Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, Hindu, or otherwise. You know, I think that it was a ability for me to learn that I could be an American that happened to be Muslim, and not just, as we say, some of the groups in America now that are Muslims demanding to be American, which is a very different mindset. And growing up in Wisconsin, I had that very important narrative that then set me straight. And when I went to the University of Wisconsin, I started to learn about all the other groups, especially the Muslim Brotherhood groups, that had a very different mindset when it came to Islam.
You know, my challenge, or what concerns me about Muslims like you in America, is we never hear about you. I remember a number of years ago, 10 years ago or so, when the local Muslim community here in Grand Rapids was raising money to build a mosque. They ultimately raised the money just like any church or temple that wanted to build. They raised the money, then they built the mosque. The people that I know that belong there are just Americans who are men of faith who wanted to worship, and they still are. But we don't ever hear about them. The people we hear about are the people that want to perhaps replace our Constitution with Sharia law, or the ones overseas who want to kill us all. Why is that? How does that happen? You didn't grow up that way. Where'd all that come from?
Again, you know, one of the things that people need to realize, and I think they'll realize from my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, is that we are a diverse community. And I know because Muslims are a minority, you know, barely 1% of the population in America, that we want to sort of check the box and say, okay, well, what do Muslims believe and how do they act and what do they think? Here's the box, and this is what they think, because they're a 1% small group. But globally, you're talking about 25% of the population. Globally, you're talking about a group like any faith group will have far left, far right politically. And within that community are going to be those that believe the faith should be a political entity, or an entity that would establish nationalities or states based in Islamic law. And that movement that has hijacked our faith, that is part of a movement that wants to create Islamic states, is really, I think, Americans just need to think about our own history. What was the American Revolution? It was a pushback against theocracy. And I think this is where we have to understand a lot of the Muslim consciousness is right now. There are many of us, when you say where are the moderate voices, they're not that loud, because the moderates that don't believe in theocracy are going to be the ones that aren't organized under the banner of Islam, that are Americans that happen to be Muslim, that are parts of your Rotary and civics clubs, your bar associations, your medical associations, etc. Remember, those that are organized in the Muslim community are going to be those especially that believe it's their primary identity, that believe it's a political movement and came to the West to evangelize Islam in a political way as part of the Muslim Brotherhood movement especially, rather than those of us that came to escape persecution for political reasons, for freedom and religious liberty.
This is Colonel Denny Gillem. You're listening to Frontlines of Freedom. We're talking with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser about his book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. Zuhdi, you served a number of years in the U.S. Navy. Take a minute and tell us about your service.
I just always had a dream to serve, and when I knew I wanted to be a physician, I was accepted into a medical scholarship program. The taxpayers paid for my medical school in Wisconsin, and then I went to serve on the USS El Paso as a medical chief medical officer there. Went to Operation Restore Hope and joined my ship on its way back from Somalia in '93. I did my training at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Washington, and ultimately served as a physician to Congress. The attending physician's office to the U.S. Congress and Supreme Court justices is a Navy clinic, and I was one of the 2 internists stationed there.
And you mentioned in your book that while you were a serving naval officer, you went to a meeting of an organization of Islamic physicians, which is reasonable, and from there, or right after it, you attended another meeting of Americans in Islam where you heard some things said that you felt were grossly anti-American. Will you take just a minute and talk about that?
Yeah, and I think that story is so important because people think the problem is terrorism and violence, or they say it's extremism. You know, I was fighting this battle long before 9/11, and I talk in the book about how, as a naval officer, I went to a meeting of this is not a small group. This is the largest Muslim group in America, and still is, the Islamic Society of North America. But they're clearly a Muslim Brotherhood legacy group, and they came out of that mindset. Well, I was there listening to the keynote address by Imam Siraj Wahhaj, and he gives his keynote, and halfway through holds up the Quran and says, we as Muslims must realize that the main problem with America is that they use a document, a constitution that's not written by God, but written by man. And we know that if they use this book written by God, that they would have a much better country and it would be an Islamic state. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And what really horrified me more wasn't just this preacher who still now is the head of is on the board of the Council on American Islamic Relations and still is very prevalent, but was the silence. It was the silence of those afterwards who said, well, you know, you really were unfair, and they told me that I, you know, should have taken care of that behind the scenes. And I'm like, listen, that's not how reform happens. You have to address these things, and this ideology is a threat. And, you know, I still continued to work behind the scenes, but after 9/11, we formed the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, realizing that Al-Qaeda is but one symptom of this underlying philosophy that Western society, governments based in the separation of mosque or church and state, they feel are not compatible with Islam. And until Muslims can fight that battle within our soul and navigate it, as I talk about in my book, we're not going to make any headway for national security.
We're absolutely not done with this topic yet, and Dr. Jasser has kindly agreed to stay with us through the break, so we'll be back shortly. I'm Colonel Denny Gillem, and you're standing tall with the Frontlines of Freedom. Stand at ease.
These days, you can't afford to be wasting time or money, especially in business. That's why I stopped going to the post office and started using Stamps.com. Now, I print real U.S. postage for all my letters and packages using just my computer and printer. And now you can start saving time and money, too. Just go to 52stamps.com and you'll get a no-risk 4-week trial plus a $100 bonus offer, including free postage at 52stamps.com.
I wanted to be in the military since I was a kid.
I served a total of 16 years.
And at 19 years old, that's the first time I ever saw somebody die.
Coming back, I was raging.
I started having pretty horrible nightmares.
I started drinking a lot.
I guess I never recognized it in myself.
It all starts with going to the VA. There's a whole community of veterans that just want to help you out.
It's for the guys who couldn't come back, so you owe it to them to live well, because they're not here with their families.
Visit maketheconnection.net.
Welcome back to Frontlines of Freedom. I'm Colonel Denny Gillem. We're glad to still have Dr. Jasser with us. Remember, we welcome your comments and questions. Email me at denny@frontlinesoffreedom.com. Dr. Jasser, one of the points that you make in your book is that Muslims make up perhaps 2% of the U.S. population, yet 80% of terror arrests are Muslims. And you wonder if maybe that's not significant. Would you talk about that, please?
Well, it's very significant because when you look at threats nowadays, we had hearings and Congressman King was vilified as the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee because he decided to look at Muslim radicalization and what our country is doing. And our Homeland Security Department right now, largest agency in government built over the last just 10 years, and yet it's basically a whack-a-mole program. And unless we can recognize that there is some association of some theological mentalities, fundamentalist, extremist mentalities that results in radical Islam, we're not going to be able to address it. The separatism that tells youth that this country is against them needs to be addressed, and we're not doing that. And as a result, you can't deny the fact when you see that of the last 220 arrests, over 180 or 80% are Muslims, that there's some association there. Now, if we say Islam is the problem, as you have so rightly felt by reading my book, you realize that it's not, and that you would alienate the very people that you need to solve this. And this is why I think we have to navigate a middle road. Islam is not the problem, but political Islam, Islamism and its separatism needs to be addressed, no different than we addressed communism in the Cold War.
And that, to me, was one of the great eye-openers as I read your book. Islamism, which you define, and I very much agree with, as the combination of the faith of Islam with the need to have politics or the government of a nation follow Islamic law as defined narrowly, basically Sharia law. Put the two of those together, and we have Islamism, whether it's the tame end, which is just seeking to overthrow or to replace our Constitution, or the extreme end, which is terrorism. That's the enemy of the United States and of all free people. Am I overstating the case, or is that true?
You're 100% correct, and it's just that my only thing I'd say, I agree with you in that Islamism those Islamists like the Brotherhood now that's taken over Egypt after its election. Remember, the Brotherhood only got 25% of the election the first time around, but yet they won a runoff. But yet this is a very potent movement, and we're not going to defeat that movement by simply dancing around it and trying to be apologetic and making sure nobody gets confused that it's not America, it's not Islam that we're fighting, etc. We have to address the ideology, and that ideology that threatens us is Islamism. And it's not just a threat. They will never, even if they claim nonviolence like the president of Egypt now is claiming, they will dissemble, dissimulate, and present things so that they can take over, no different than we saw in Iran when they took over, and now they're not our allies. Islamic states will not be allies with secular states because it's just not in their history, and we need to reform these. And that's why we've built a coalition, the American Islamic Leadership Coalition, that is a growing group of leading organizations, journalists, and others that are moving with one thing in common. It includes some of us that are conservative, some that are liberal. It's not a partisan issue, but we formed this coalition to fight one thing, which is political Islam as devout Muslims. And you'll find in Muslim countries, the majority of Muslims don't want Islamists running the place. But if America continues to help the Islamists, they're going to look to the West and say, gee, they're helping, just like they did with the Saudi corrupt monarchies and others. They're continuing to help our oppressors rather than help those that want freedom and liberty.
This is Colonel Denny Gillem on Frontlines of Freedom, and we're discussing the challenge with Islamists and Islamism with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. One of the things you said in the book that really struck home was Dr. Major Hasan, who murdered some fellow soldiers at Fort Hood, and the American military Pentagon report never mentioned radical Islam, never mentioned Islamism, never suggested that his faith in any way impacted on his actions. That is true. What's your response to that?
My response is that we are not going to make any headway. Just right now, that report was from January 2011, and yet just a few weeks ago, we saw a report that said there are over 100 Islamists they feel that have infiltrated the military, and 10 to 20 of those are extremely dangerous ones that might be of significant security concerns within the military. Now, does that mean we should target all Muslims? Absolutely not. The vast majority of the 10,000 or so Muslims serving in active duty, like myself, are patriots that are in uniform because they want to fight this. However, they also, most of them, I'm sure, realistically would say, please profile the Muslims and take a look at those of us in the military so that we don't have the Islamists in our midst, just like we looked for communist sympathizers in the military during the Cold War, and those that were working and sympathetic with the Soviets, etc., were a major threat. And I think similarly, unless we can identify the ideas and look at jihadism, etc., Nidal Hasan, in the months before, was trying to convert patients at Walter Reed. He was giving presentations on jihad and the Quran when he should have been given medical presentations, and yet nobody said anything. He was walking around with a business card that said Soldier of Allah, and nobody said anything. They thought about it, and now after the review, the admirals and generals want to run up the flagpole, those people that didn't say anything, but yet the brass themselves in the report couldn't even mention his name or his faith or any of that, or his theology as the threat. And that tells you that political correctness continues to hamper and obstruct any type of progress in dissecting the ideas that we never will be able to dissect unless we start having more experts on political Islam. And the CIA, by the way, as you probably know, is one of the only departments in Washington that has a division on political Islam. And they're not doing that by accident. It's because they realize that's one of the main threats.
Wahhabism is the state religion of Saudi Arabia. They've got lots of money, and they have a lot of paid activities in the United States, preaching, teaching, proselytizing, anti-America, anti-Constitution. Am I wrong?
Not at all. And, this is I have a chapter in the book called Changing the Paradigm, in which I ask Americans that, after you look at my narrative, my own biography, and why I came here, what is the paradigm in our dealings with the Middle East? Are we going to continue to deal with short-sighted election cycle approach to Middle Eastern foreign policy, where we say, okay, well, the Saudis are working with us against Al-Qaeda, so we're going to be their allies and take, fawning pictures with them and say that they're our best friends, when at the end of the day they're still fueling billions of dollars into a global industry of anti-Westernism, anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, and other type of supremacist ideas that come out of a very backwards medieval interpretation of Islam. And that's why I talk in that chapter about we need to reboot and start over and say, you know what, since the fall of the Soviet Union, we no longer have to be worried primarily about the Soviets, that now we need to start being more clear morally about what the threats are within each of these countries.
Folks, there's 20 more subjects I'd like to talk with Dr. Jasser about, but we're out of time. Dr. Jasser, your book is A Battle for the Soul of Islam. How can people get a copy? Because listeners, I strongly encourage you to get a copy and read it and make it part of your permanent library.
Yeah, I would ask people to go to our website, battleforthesoulofislam.com, battleforthesoulofislam.com, or they can go to Amazon or Simon & Schuster or Barnes & Noble or any of the major booksellers.
Folks, I strongly encourage you to get a copy of that book. It will really give you insight into today's problems that you'll get nowhere else. I just came from a lecture by a very senior, knowledgeable American on foreign policy, and he didn't even mention Islamism or Islamic-based terror. Didn't mention it. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Jasser. Thank you for your past and present service to this nation. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Colonel. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. God bless.
I'm Colonel Denny Gillem. Next up, some military history, and then we're going to give away another book. You've reported for duty to Frontlines of Freedom. Stand easy.
For America's wounded warriors, coming home can sometimes be a battle in itself. Making the transition back to civilian life or active duty with a traumatic injury can be the challenge of a lifetime. The USO provides every American a way to support our wounded warriors and their families through every phase of their medical treatment and rehabilitation. It's how all of us, as a community, can give something back to our heroes. It's how we can say thank you and assure them that their sacrifice is recognized and appreciated by every one of us. Join us. Visit USO.org to learn how you can make a difference in the lives of our wounded warriors and their families. The USO, until everyone comes home.
I'm Colonel Denny Gillem. You're at the final formation for this week on the Frontlines of Freedom. Elliot Chodov is an Israeli, a political military analyst, a lecturer at the University of Haifa and other universities, a reserve major in the Israeli Defense Forces, a terrorism expert, and not a spokesman for the Israeli government. He's also a friend, and I drug him off the street because he was in town, and I wanted him to comment on Dr. Jasser's comments that we just heard. Dr. Jasser, as you'll recollect, basically identified the enemy of America, because Dr. Jasser is primarily an American patriot, but also the enemy of peace in the world as Islamism, which is a combination of the Islam religion, which is an honest faith, and the political ideology that basically Sharia law must be the law of all nations everywhere. Therefore, they would undermine the Constitution of the United States in the United States, and he sees those who are Islamists as the enemy of the United States. That's his primary focus. Elliot, what do you think about that? Does that make sense to you?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I would add to that it's also an ideology of conquest. In other words, we're not just talking about a political ideology that says, okay, we're going to simply convince people. The Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is now in the process of taking over Egypt, has a very clearly stated motto ideology that dates back to its inception in the 1920s, that jihad, or holy war, is their way. Now, that doesn't mean they practice it all the time, and I think this is something that many people are confused about, because they're not in perpetual war, but they're in perpetual conflict.
So they are not only the enemy of the world, but the world peace everywhere. Fair summary?
Fair summary, and that includes the Muslim world.
Elliot, thank you much. We're going to have you back next week to talk about all this impact on Israel. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Now it's time for military history. On 16 July 1862, during the Civil War, David Farragut, in recognition of his victory at New Orleans, was promoted to the newly created rank of Rear Admiral, the first officer to hold that rank in the history of our Navy. Rear Admirals were a rank with Major Generals in the Army. By the way, it was Farragut who made the famous statement, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Oh, back then, torpedoes were what we now call mines. On 16 June 1945, the U.S. conducted the first test of the atomic bomb in its research facility at Los Alamos. Official development of the atomic bomb began with the establishment of the Manhattan Project in August of 1942 during World War II. The project was urgent as Nazi Germany was also working to develop an atomic weapon. By July 1945, a prototype was ready for testing. Though Germany had just surrendered, the war against Japan was still raging. And on 16 July, the first atomic bomb was detonated in the desert. News of the successful test was relayed to President Truman, who was meeting with the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in Potsdam to discuss the post-war world. Observers noted that Truman almost immediately adopted a more aggressive tone in dealing with Stalin. U.S. officials had hoped that the possession of the atomic bomb would be America's trump card in dealing with the Soviets after the war. Use of the weapon against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that August demonstrated the destructive power of the atomic bomb. The American atomic monopoly didn't last that long, though. By 1949, the Soviets had stolen our secrets and developed their own atomic bomb, marking the beginning of the nuclear arms race. And on 16 July 2003, it was decided that a 32-year-old Army sergeant accused of killing 2 officers in a grenade attack on fellow American troops in Kuwait that March would face a court-martial trial on a murder charge that could bring the death penalty. Major General David Petraeus, then commander of the 101st Airborne Division, directed that Sergeant Hasan Akbar face a court-martial charge with 2 counts of premeditated murder and 3 counts of attempted murder stemming from the incident in Kuwait, where he allegedly attacked fellow troops stationed there. Note that, just as when Major Hasan killed fellow soldiers in Fort Hood, our politically correct Army was afraid to say that the motivation was that of radical Islam. Like Hasan, this man should have been charged with treason, as Dr. Jasser and I discussed earlier in the show. On 17 July 1776, the Continental Congress learned of General George Washington's refusal to accept a dispatch from British General Howe opening peace negotiations because the letter failed to use the title General. In response, Congress proclaimed that the commander-in-chief acted, quote, with dignity becoming his station, and directed all American commanders to receive only letters addressed to them in, quote, the characters they respectively sustain. Finally, an armed citizen report. Our Constitution expects all citizens to be armed. So does common sense. Here's one example why. 2 illegal aliens, Rafael Resendez, 23, and Enrico Garza, 26, probably believed they'd have easy time overpowering home alone 11-year-old Patricia Harrington after her father left their 2-story Butte, Montana home. Oops, Patricia had been a clay shooting champion since she was 9 and was in her upstairs room when the 2 men broke through the front door of the house. She quickly ran to her father's room and grabbed his 12-gauge Mossberg 500 shotgun. Resendez was the first to get up to the 2nd floor, only to be the first to catch a near point-blank blast of buckshot from the 11-year-old's knee-crouch aim. He suffered fatal wounds. When Garza ran to the foot of the stairs, he took a blast to the left shoulder and staggered out to the street where he bled to death before help could arrive. Resendez was armed with a stolen handgun he took from another home invasion robbery. That victim, 50-year-old David O'Burren, died from stab wounds to the chest. An 11-year-old girl, properly trained, defended her home and herself against 2 men and won. Now, a notice by the U.S. Navy in West Michigan. You're invited to a Future Sailors Friends and Family Night this Wednesday, July 18, at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum in downtown Grand Rapids. Future sailors, which is young men and women who have enlisted in the Navy under the Delayed Entry Program, will be there along with parents and friends. The goal is to demystify the Navy for the soon-to-be recruits and their parents through video presentations, question and answers, meet the recruiters, exhibits, and one-on-one interaction. Doors open at 6 p.m. The event begins at 6:30 and will go until about 8. Light refreshments will be served.
And now it's time for our Frontlines of Freedom Weapon of the Week. I'm former Air Force LT Josh Lang, and this week's weapon is one of the most controversial we've had in recent years. This weapon is usually referred to as a weapon delivery system because it is loaded with an array of some of the most highly advanced individual weapons in our Air Force's inventory. Have you figured it out yet? I'm talking about the F-22 Raptor, the newest manned stealth fighter in our Air Force's operational inventory. The Raptor's production run completed last year after only 185 of the $150 million jets were produced by Lockheed Martin. Politicians in the Senate and President Obama said their decision to end production was to focus funds instead on the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. So what can our enemies expect when they tangle with a Raptor? At only 62 feet long and 44.5-foot wingspan, and with the latest stealth technology, odds are they won't see a thing. But they will feel the wrath of the Raptor. Our F-22s have 3 internal weapons bays, and the air combat missile of choice is the AIM-120 AMRAAM. They can carry 6 medium-range missiles and 2 shorter-range missiles, which can even be launched during supercruise, because the Raptor's design only requires opening the weapons bay doors for less than a second. The F-22 can also carry air-to-surface JDAM bombs, and it has an M61A2 Vulcan 22mm cannon in the right wing root. She's a nasty bird with one heck of a bite. But the Raptor has one big problem. It's been putting our best pilots at major risk of dizziness and blackout due to oxygen system problems resulting in hypoxia. Just this week, a Hawaii National Guard pilot felt dizzy while piloting the F-22, but fortunately he activated his emergency oxygen system until his condition and the plane's oxygen generating system returned to normal. We'll take a more in-depth look at this issue in the near future here on Frontlines of Freedom. For now, the F-22 Raptor is your weapon of the week. Back to you, Colonel.
This week, our book giveaway is The Home of the Brave, honoring the unsung heroes in the War on Terror. The author is former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. To get in on the drawing, email me, Denny@frontlinesoffreedom.com. Put Home of the Brave in the subject line. Next week on Frontlines of Freedom, Elliot Chodoff, an Israeli military political analyst who is a reserve major in the Israeli Defense Force and a terrorism expert, will join us again to discuss the situation in Israel. The following week, we'll be discussing the replacement for the Stolen Valor Act. The replacement recently proposed in Congress is a disaster. We need one that'll work. Please check out Frontlines of Freedom on Facebook and add your comments. The discussions we began just now will continue all week on Facebook. See you there. I'm Colonel Denny Gillem. Thank you, listeners all across America, for joining us in the foxholes on the Frontlines of Freedom. And join me next week for military and veteran information you won't get anywhere else. On the Frontlines of Freedom, dismissed.
Take care, Grandma.
Okay, baby. Don't forget to let me know the second you get there.
Yes, ma'am.
My grandson always tells me I worry about him too much. And of course I do. I'm his grandma. Well, I was worried sick when he came home from Afghanistan. He came back wounded. It wasn't a wound you could see. It was a wound inside. Post-traumatic stress disorder. My T couldn't sleep. He was angry all the time. He felt like he didn't fit in anywhere. Then I heard about this group, Wounded Warrior Project, people helping warriors like T. So I figured who better to help my grandson than people who could understand what he'd been through. Now, I don't know what they do there, but my T is smiling again. So I figured they must be good people.
1 out of every 5 warriors return from the battlefield with post-traumatic stress disorder. Help support them at woundedwarriorproject.org.